Think about this for a second. In 1985, the Soviet Union was an absolute behemoth, one of two global superpowers, a nuclear-armed empire stretching across 11 time zones. And then, poof, just 6 years later, it was gone, vanished. So how on earth does that happen? That's what we're going to dig into today.
I mean, really, let that sink in. This is one of the most sudden and shocking political collapses in modern history. How does a superpower that dominated half the globe for decades just disappear? It's a huge question, right? To get to the bottom of it, we have to rewind the clock a bit, back to where the first cracks started to show. Okay, so our story really starts in March 1985. That's when a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, steps onto the scene. And let me tell you, he inherited an empire that looked mighty on the outside, but was secretly falling apart. It was a giant for sure, but a giant standing on some seriously shaky ground. So what was wrong? Well, for starters, the engine of the entire country, its economy, was just sputtering out. Economic growth had slowed to a crawl, less than 2%. Now, that might not sound like a total disaster, but for a top-down, planned economy like the Soviet Union's, it was a red alert, a huge sign that the whole system was fundamentally broken. And here's one of the biggest reasons why. Can you guess where all the money was going? The military. A mind-boggling 25% of the entire economy. I mean, a full quarter of every single thing the country produced was being funneled into the arms race against the US. That kind of spending absolutely starves everything else. Healthcare, farming, making simple things for people to buy. It was all being sacrificed for tanks and missiles. And for the average person living in the Soviet Union, this wasn't some abstract economic theory. This was real life. It meant you'd go to the store and find the shelves totally empty. It meant your standard of living was actually going down. And on top of all that, there was the endless, bloody war in Afghanistan, which had already cost 15,000 Soviet soldiers their lives. The system just wasn't working for its people. Not anymore. So into this mess steps our guy, Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, you gotta understand, Gorbachev wasn't a revolutionary trying to tear the system down. Nope, he was a true believer. His goal was to save the Soviet Union. He thought, okay, the system is broken, but we can fix it, we can modernize it. And he had a pretty audacious plan to do just that. His first big move was a policy called perestroika. In Russian, that means restructuring. This was all about the economy. The idea was to shake things up, introduce some small-scale market-style ideas, and basically try to jumpstart the economy that had ground to a halt. But his second idea? Whew, boy, this was the truly explosive one. It was called glasnost, which means openness. The logic seemed pretty sound, right? Let's allow people to speak up, to criticize, to point out what's wrong so that we, the government, can actually fix it. Gorbachev thought of it as a carefully controlled pressure release valve for society. Yeah, about that pressure valve. Instead of a gentle hiss of steam, glasnost blew the entire lid clean off the pot. All the anger, all the frustration that had been bottled up for decades just came roaring out. And right at this incredibly fragile moment, a disaster of unimaginable scale happened, one that would show the whole world just how rotten the old system really was. We're talking, of course, about Chernobyl. The explosion at that nuclear power plant wasn't just some tragic industrial accident. It became a political firestorm that the regime just could not survive. In fact, many historians look back at this exact moment and say, yep, that was the beginning of the end for the USSR. So on April 26, 1986, the reactor blew. And what was the government's first move? Not to warn people, not to ask for help, but to cover it up. Secrecy, denial. And in this new era of openness, that was the worst possible thing they could have done. It completely shattered any trust people might have had left. It was proof positive that the system wasn't just broken, it was built on lies. So while all this chaos is unfolding at home, Gorbachev is also trying to completely overhaul Soviet foreign policy. He called it new thinking. And the goal was pretty logical. Ease tensions with the West, maybe get out of that crippling arms race. But just like with Glasnost, this well-intentioned plan was about to backfire in a spectacular way. See, Gorbachev basically told the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, hey, we're not going to send in the tanks anymore. They even had a funny name for it, the Sinatra Doctrine. Because now these countries could do it their way. Well, it turns out their way was to get rid of communism as fast as humanly possible. The result was a tidal wave. In the single, unbelievable year of 1989, these regimes just fell like dominoes, ending, of course, with the most famous moment of all, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that domino effect didn't just stop at the Soviet border. The 15 republics inside the USSR were watching all of this. And they thought, hey, if Poland can do it, why can't we? A huge wave of nationalism just swept across the Union. Lithuania was the first to officially declare independence in 1990. Latvia and Estonia were right behind them. The empire was literally starting to crumble from the outside in.
Okay, as you can imagine, the old-school communist hardliners are watching this, and they are absolutely panicking. To them, Gorbachev wasn't saving the system, he was killing it. So, in August of 1991, they decide enough is enough. They launch a desperate, last-ditch coup to slam on the brakes and drag the country back to the way things were. And the imagery from this moment is just incredible. It tells you everything you need to know. On one side, you have the coup leader on TV, his hands literally shaking for the whole world to see. He's the face of the weak, dying old guard. And on the other side, you have this firebrand politician, Boris Yeltsin, climbing on top of a tank, rallying the crowds in Moscow to resist. Talk about a powerful image. Well, the coup was a complete and utter disaster. It fizzled out in just 3 days. And here's the ultimate irony. This desperate attempt to save the Communist Party's power was the very thing that destroyed it, once and for all. It was the final nail in the coffin. After that failed coup, the floodgates just burst open. Any shred of authority the central government in Moscow had was gone. And the final unraveling happened so fast it was dizzying. It was a rapid-fire series of events. First, all the other republics basically sprinted for the exit, declaring independence. Then, on December 8th, the leaders of the 3 biggest republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, got together and signed a document that officially dissolved the USSR. It was over. On Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev gave his resignation speech. And then came the final, iconic moment. The red hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time ever. And what came next was, frankly, chaos. For millions of ordinary people, the collapse of the empire wasn't a celebration. It was the start of an economic nightmare. In Russia alone, inflation in 1992 shot up over 2,000%. Can you even imagine? People's life savings were wiped out overnight. It was a brutal, brutal time. Which brings us back to the great irony of this whole story. Remember Gorbachev, the man who just wanted to save the Soviet Union? His own reforms, the very tools he designed to fix the system, were what ended up destroying it. They unleashed forces, nationalism, public anger that had been buried for decades, and once they were out, no one could put them back in the bottle. The great Soviet superpower wasn't brought down by a foreign rival. It rotted from the inside out. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. Gorbachev's reforms were clearly the trigger, but the gun was already loaded, right? The system was already sick. So was the collapse bound to happen no matter what? Or could someone else, a different leader with a different vision, have actually saved the Soviet empire from itself? It's one of history's great what-ifs, and honestly, it's something people are still arguing about to this day.